Bring, bring. Hello? Yes, Lord Thorin Skillfort? This is him speaking. Tax. Yes, I earn a lot of money. How do I acquire that money exactly? Well, self-employed, fantastic journalist, do events and stuff. Yeah, about that. That massive amount of skrill coming in on a regular basis comes actually from a company called Alpha Draft. You don't know what Alpha Draft is? Okay, then. Alpha Draft is a fantasy esports service. Probably the best, if you're asking me. Actually, I know you're not. I mean, that has nothing to do with taxation or anything, but my opinion. Keep listening. You can play League of Legends there. Do you play League of Legends? Of course you do, you fucking pleb. You could play Dota 2 there if you want to actually up your game. Maybe get into a more cerebral sort of game with a lot more skill. But no, not your thing. Okay, fair enough. Maybe you've played Counter-Strike. I know a lot of you plebs in the past used to like some Counter-Strike. You look at it, you think it's all just about headshots and stuff. It's not just about headshots. You don't know fucking anything about the game. But, you know, maybe you can get into that if you apply yourself. Is numbers will help you understand the game. You like numbers, right? I like numbers, and I get numbers, motherfucker. Pay me. Not you, Alpha Draft, obviously. So Alpha Draft is a fantasy esports service where you can get that sort of stuff. And if you want to play there, play there. Maybe you could win lots of money. Maybe someone will be wrecking you for loads of taxation. Anyway, ultimately, it doesn't matter how much tax I have to pay because I'm making fucking Skrilla. Anyway, so enough of that. So when we talk about the topic of the language of the game, both in terms of communication within the game, but also in terms of the notion that the game has a language to it, that it is a fabric, that it's kind of a territory, and the way people operate and move around within that and interact with it is a kind of communication, is a kind of interaction between themselves and the landscape, and that there's a poetry, there's a music, there is a language to that in any game, League of Legends, Dota 2, CSGO, whatever it might be. Now, what made me think of this particular topic and the way I've framed it is, quite a while ago, I think it was actually my first ever AMA, Ask Me Anything thread, on the League of Legends subreddit, someone asked me to make like my all-star team. And I made the all-star team, and I actually picked players from 4 different regions. I had players from Korea, China, Europe, and North America. And obviously, the first thing you'd run into, even if it was an all-star type event, is, well, they obviously don't speak the same common language. Like at the time, the players from China and from Korea would have had very poor English. Obviously, the players from Europe and North America could understand each other well. So there wouldn't be any shared language. So I made this point in perhaps a witty, pithy way to state it. But I actually did genuinely mean this, and there was something tangible behind this in terms of a concept, which is I said they don't need to speak a common language. Geniuses speak the language of the game with their play. Now, I actually think this is the way it is. Like, to me, a great player within a game, much as a great player of an instrument, or someone who's fantastic with words or speech, whether it's written or spoken, is an artist. To me, a great player is an artist. The way they play is art, the way their style becomes defined and becomes so uniquely expressive of themselves, and thus the way they communicate themselves and express themselves through their play and communicate themselves with the mass of the game, the other players in the game, the way they react to the opponent, that is art, that is expression, that is communication in itself. So communicating through their play in that aspect certainly has some raw benefit. But when we talk about communication between players, because in games like CSGO and League of Legends, these are team games. To me, communication, overt communication, where you actually speak and you express an idea through these ape-like small mouth movements that make tiny vibrations that go through the air and hit your fucking tympanic membrane, your eardrum. When you're talking about that level, that is actually there. My theory has been that I've crafted largely to artificially create the kind of team play, the way you play off and interact with each other to battle an opponent through strategy or what you're going to do next, or giving communication to each other, more information from the one person who might have his own perspective to the wider perspective by having their information points. You're trying to artificially create the kind of team play that is actually comparable to what great players who have this feel for the game and express themselves so completely and uniquely actually have together when they have a natural synergy. Just they have an unspoken way of playing off each other, where when one does something, the other one just feels like he knows what needs to come next. And when they both play at an excellent level, they seem to vibe in a certain manner that makes them play a fantastic game. Well, there's a great example, a bunch of examples actually from the NBA I could give you of this. So Kobe Bryant and Pau Gasol, when Pau Gasol got traded to the Lakers in 2008, almost immediately, they had this great synergy. Power was playing the center position at the time because Barnum was out. And Kobe and Power had a natural great synergy of how to play off each other, how to do two-man pick-and-roll type plays, how to attack the basket, how to do follow-ups, how to move back defensively. They had a great natural synergy that didn't come from lots and lots of practice and playing together for a long time. In fact, there was a mid-season change that they had near the trade deadline. So naturally, they had one there. A long-time famous one in the NBA is John Stockton and Karl Malone, probably the best in history at running the pick and roll. And that wasn't just the practice that they drilled it in practice. Obviously, Jerry Sloan's flex offense was built around this main 1-2 play, but they just had an extra communication level where a slight look from one of them, the way the other guy had spun off 2 more times, made the other one just sense that he was going to go straight to the basket this time. The way that they did this was so beautiful that even when you knew it was coming, you just couldn't stop it most of the time. And in modern day, for the people who haven't watched the NBA for very long, obviously Dwayne Wade and LeBron James, they don't play positions that naturally interact as much, but they're players where they were fantastic on the fast break. They would nearly all the time complete every alley-oop, every great play off each other. The way they'd know when one should take a shot and when the other. You can't chart that stuff down. There wasn't a set code in place. They weren't always overtly speaking what they were going to do next, but they understood their styles fit together and they meshed them together, and then they learned to understand the communication that's involved with the language of the game, as well as actual language and communication overtly, explicitly in words within the game. I mean, if you want to talk about that, the reason why you usually need that kind of communication is because most normal players, even normal pros, don't know what the other pro's thinking. They don't know what that other pro wants to do. They don't know what the other pro is going to do. And likewise, as their teammate, you don't know that. And so you need to say things to update them on where you are, what you're thinking of next, what you're imagining, how you're visualizing what the enemy's going to do. And then by using that, you're then going to make the decisions, which is what the decisions you would have made anyway if you were great players who had the natural synergy. But you're going to use that artificial aspect to make sure it's more in line, so that then when you act from what your intuition tells you to do, your instincts, it's going to be more in line with what's going to happen. And then you're not going to run into conflicts of interest where you're going in and the other guy thought you were going to pull out now, or he doesn't know how you want to attack this next area. Artificial communication can bridge some of that gap. But you see, there are great players in esports games who don't need that. I mean, a famous example in CSGO is the 1-2 punch, which has built the greatest dynasty in the history of CSGO, which is Fnatic. Now, Olaf Meister and Krims have been playing together since LGB in late 2013, and they still play together now, and they are fucking amazing. These guys barely talk. You can go and listen to the comms. They barely talk, yet the way they play off each other in sites is beautiful. The way they play when they're opening up sites entry-wise on T-side, the way they play when they're in clutch situations like 2v4s, you would think, if you watch it without the comms, that they must be comming all the time. They must have the most perfect comms. They must have a lot of code words as to what they mean. They say barely anything. But just the natural way that they play off each other instinctively and intuitively is so phenomenal to watch that if you want to get close to that, you probably will never get that good. If you want to get close to it, you better build in lots of artificial traps and little code words and shorthand for what things mean, and one of you learn the other style and adapt to that guy to get close to approximate that. They don't have to do that naturally, though. And it's more than just having played for years. They have this special chemistry. In League of Legends, a great example of this for me has to be Gambit, because Moscow 5 and Gambit, that 5-man lineup, Darien, Diamond Prox, Alex Ich, Genja, Edward / Gosu Pepper, what made them so fucking phenomenal wasn't the laning that they had at certain points in time. It wasn't the unique, innovative picks they had. These were all great factors that helped them become the best at one point in time and then stay relevant. But the key quality they always had that made them amazing was the team fighting. And what made their team fighting different was whenever one of them went in, they always all came in together. There wasn't hesitancy there. There wasn't second guessing. But it's not like they all just piled in and then everyone hit everyone and everyone did every ability and then you just hoped at the end that somehow you emerged from the dust of like some fucking Dragon Ball Z scenario and you'd won the fight. It wasn't like that. Instead, it was that, yes, they would go in, but then the way that, like, the carry would kite out of the fight and Genja would be staying on the outside doing damage, and the way that Alex Ich would be getting everything spammed onto him, but he'd be doing mad damage, moving around, picking the times of when to be aggressive and get the kills, the way Diamond Prox would be all over them, the way Ghost of Pepper would be fucking them up with CC, the way Darien would be doing whatever the fuck Darien wants to do. The way this all blended together was absolutely beautiful. And as a result, they would kite opponents out. They would collapse back in on them. They're one of the best I've ever seen in League of Legends, of starting a fight, going into the fight initially, coming out so that the opponent's in two minds. Are we fighting here? Are we pulling back? And then re-engaging when it's more favourable, and you can go on to one target, killing him and then being in a favourable advantage. That's why they could team fight from goal disadvantages, from items behind, from down in terms of objectives, and win whole games from doing so. The natural understanding of how the game can and should be played comes from not just communication, not just natural chemistry, but also having a coherent style that fits you as a player and then fits your team. If you have the natural coherent style and the team happens to be either fortuitously or purposely built well, so it's not people who are fantastic players but having to play a totally different style from what they're normally expecting to, then it will naturally work out very well. I mean, one of the reasons why I thought Team Liquid in League of Legends was particularly poor in 2015 was they had all these good players and they would get these advantages, but the style that they tried to play, this late game team fighting style, wasn't fitting their style at all. It wasn't their strength. And then on top of it, you listen to the comms, and the comms weren't very good. And I talked to some of the players, and they admitted, yeah, we didn't have good shot calling, we didn't have decisive shot calling, and we would try to just make individual plays. And so as a result, it was just 5 individuals making plays, and there wasn't any of that coherency. There wasn't any of that strength that comes from the communication of how to play the game in terms of understanding what the game wants, and what you can express completely. And also, there wasn't the communication within the players to artificially build that up. It's not only just understanding what is possible, but it's being within your time. If you're a team out of time, like we later saw with Gambit in later years, suddenly that's not as valuable. They weren't in rhythm, in step with the way the game was being played. They couldn't respond and react and provoke the game in the way they'd been able to when it was perfectly suited to their time, and other teams hadn't adapted to anything they were doing or built up. The other teams, crucially, obviously, over the years with coaching, built up proper hierarchies of communication and had shot callers. So this style, as good as it was, could be superseded in other certain ways. Now, one of the other things that was interesting was, because I'm often reading alchemical or occult or hermetic books, and so I remember reading, when I talk about this topic of language, about something called the language of the birds. And this is an occult term for what's essentially, they considered, we're talking like medieval times here, they considered birds to communicate, not just in song that means nothing, that's mating calls, which is how we'd probably think of them, and, well, in terms of like someone in biology would explain that's the way that what the purpose of the bird's communication is, a behaviorist. In reality, well, in their version, what they conceived of it as was this was a special language, and it was some kind of like angelic or magical language. And the idea was, if you were an initiate, someone who'd undergone some sort of magical training, an adept of some sort of occult school, you would be able to understand this, and it would be able to communicate something to you in some particular way. So this notion, though, is kind of how I see language beyond the artificial, explicit spoken language, in terms of the game, the way you read the game and the way you understand the flow of the game, and you're in tune with the game, and then the way that you express yourself works within the field of the game. That is a language in itself. And so that's why language and communication that is used is so important as well when it comes to the artificial aspect that you want to build up. Because there's so many people I see underestimate the quality of the communication. They think of communication primarily in terms of the quantity. They want people talking all the time, giving information all the time, so everyone has a lot of information, and then they want people saying what they want to do all the time, and they want to have a lot of decision making. It's the quality of the communication that seems to be the thing lacking a lot in CSGO and in League of Legends at the moment. People can address, okay, in terms of the quantity when there's not enough. That's the one they can always address. They'll always say like, oh, there's too much silence. People suddenly were getting quiet, and that's when we were losing the game, and we needed more calls. And then the shot caller wasn't really as decisive. So a great League of Legends example is in Season 4. This is something that a lot of the Fnatic players told me, actually, that Yellowstar was this great shot caller, but sometimes he'd go quiet when it was going badly, or he'd just get discouraged when people hadn't followed up on his calls of what he'd said, and then that thing would happen. And so he himself wasn't communicating enough, and it was easy to see that. What people never address is when players are talking too much and in a way that isn't quality communication. So they're actually forming a kind of signal noise by people just shouting out the same info, or info that's not that important within the hierarchy, what you need to know and what you need to say at this moment. And so it becomes a kind of signal noise that drowns out the efficient communication. So a great example of this, obviously, in both League of Legends and CSGO, but particularly CSGO is a famous one because we have voice comms in that game, naturally within matchmaking, is North American League of Legends in CSGO and League of Legends, obviously. It's players just shouting the same things. The guy there, the same thing. B, attack this E, V, rather than just say, go Eve. And then everyone does that and listens to the shot caller. Oh, no, change it. Go over to this guy. Rather than make it efficient and communicative, they fill the whole space with that. So there's nothing else more you can say that. You can't be then saying a timer on something. You can't then be saying this thing's burned to the same degree. It's getting drowned out to some degree. This is a famous problem that they have. I mean, famously in League of Legends in the West, it used to be everyone, they wouldn't even have a shot caller. This is what famously CLGEU told me. They would literally all just shout out what they wanted to do and who they thought they should attack, and they would hope that by someone being more fervent, going, no, Eve, while the other guy's going, Vayne, that hopefully then one of them would go, oh, yeah, Eve, and then they'd go and do that. Well, what a terrible system that is for shot calling and for communication, obviously. That's why you see that all those guys who said they didn't need it, like CLGEU, like the old CLG teams, they've all learned now the best teams have the single shot caller because it cuts out a lot of this shit. You have one voice making the decisions. It makes it more streamlined, more decisive. They can harness everything into a consistency of style of play, so you know what you're trying to accomplish. Think of some of the greatest shot callers in time. This is the style of play they have. High for Cloud9, getting the information, then making his calls, giving miniature calls which build into an overall plan that allows him to ground back in the games. Yellow Star, calling out and reading what the opponent's going to do, where we need to go at this point in time, what the correct decision is when they've got a big branch of things to do. We've seen how he developed into that role, and then with the rookies, he was phenomenal at that. Ryu, with KT roles to be, and now when he's in H2K, where he doesn't even have the greatest English to communicate with people, but he gives the decisive call and people know they can trust that, and it makes everyone else not have to go decide between each other what they're going to do when people are unsure. Going over comms to streamline them and make a hierarchy of who speaks when and whose like word is taken most importantly is actually very important. It's something teams have had to learn and that they still need to work on in the West if they really want to get to that level. Because they can do it to some degree in Korea by the coach stressing it, by practicing certain things, and then also having this hierarchy of like authority within the team that we don't necessarily have as much in the West. It's also important to have decisive shot calling. That's why we need to put some of these things in place. Because we think of some famous examples of where the shot calling wasn't decisive. Like it could be okay sometimes, but then under pressure it would wilt. Or when there was too many options and they couldn't come to the perfect one. Jouster obviously is a great example of that in CLG. Then another CLG player, Link, when he was doing some of the shot calling, but then would suddenly get discouraged in big games, in playoff games, things would fall apart, they wouldn't be able to recover. These are problems that didn't happen to people like High. In obviously CSGO, we've seen good in-game leaders get overwhelmed by the game going on, whereas people like Fallen stick with the good tactics over and over. They grind games out. We look at people like Pronax, always coming with an intelligent approach. He has some of the best players in the world, but he didn't play that risky, envious style. He played a hybrid of sensible Counter-Strike with good economic management and then knowing when to turn the star players loose. We look at someone like Existence, a very strict style where he needs a certain aspect like that, and you can only get away with being a more autonomous if you are a Shox, KDS style, godlike player. Then he'll give you that freedom. So we can see the difference between the good shot callers and the not so good shot callers and how the communication aspect affects the game in that sense. Because when great players are playing a game and when great teams are playing a game, this communication really does, to me, become like a duet or a song with different parts. And as one does something, what makes the game fantastic and the song fantastic is the way the other guy responds to it and either complements it or takes that and modifies it to another aspect which drives more out of the original person, or he rebuttals it and then that other person has to come up to that challenge, else wilt away. This becomes this back and forth and this flow and this harmony to the play. And the really best games are when obviously both teams are playing at a fantastic level and the harmony and the fantastic differences between the teams and stylistic clashes sometimes elevate the game into something special, something poetic beyond just people playing a video game.